Hi, this is Larry Varvel here at First United Methodist Church in Broken Arrow, continuing a lesson series that I'm teaching here on Wednesday nights that I'm calling Judaism and Islam, Palestine and Israel. Over the last 3 sessions, I've spent a couple of weeks talking about the history of Islam and the growth of Islam as a religion. In our last lesson, I talked about Judaism, both biblical Judaism and that history of the Jewish people that occurred after the Old Testament and before the New Testament, that what we call the intertestamental period. I want to talk more about Judaism today. I want to start with a question that I'm asked often, which is, what is the difference between the different branches or kinds of Judaism? Now, we as Christians, if you're listening to this and you're a Christian, you know that in the body of Christ, in the Christian church, we have all these denominations. When I teach confirmation to our young people, I say, think about it like a tree. Think about it like the trunk of a tree, and for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, there is no denomination. There are just churches in different towns and communities. There's no central authority. There's just the church, first under persecution and then growing. And so for 1,000 years of Christianity, there is no such thing as a denomination. We know about 1000 AD, the Christian church has a split, the first split between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And this causes a break in Christianity. We know about 500 years after that, in the Western branch of Christianity, there's another breach that we call the Protestant Reformation, when the Protestants and the Catholics split off. We know the Protestant movement is not a single branch, but it very quickly is a multitude of branches, a Lutheran branch, a Calvinist or Presbyterian branch, eventually a Church of England branch, and that we, United Methodists, come out of that branch. The United Methodist Church is born out of John Wesley being in the Church of England. And if you were to look at a diagram of that tree today, you would see literally hundreds of branches, hundreds of Christian denominations, all of them going back probably, though, to one of those 3 major branches of Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. That's our family tree in Christianity. Well, Judaism doesn't have hundreds of denominations, but Judaism does have some major branches. And those really only come about in the 18th century, this division of Judaism into different branches. Now, think about the 18th century. When I'm talking about, of course, the 1700s, that time in which here in America, our country was born out of the 1700s. But if you think about Western civilization in the 1700s, there was a movement that is all across Western Europe and indeed the Americas that occurs in the 1700s. And this movement is sometimes called the Age of Reason, the Age of Rationality, the Age of Science. But the term that is most often applied to this philosophical movement in the 1700s is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. The history of thought and philosophy is often divided into major movements. We think about the period from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD, that 1,000-year period. We call that the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages ends around 1500, not only with the Reformation, but with what is usually called the Renaissance, the rebirth of civilization, the explosion of art and music in so many ways. Well, in the 1700s, the movement, the philosophical, social, scientific, literary movement is often lumped together and called the Enlightenment. That doesn't mean that anyone before that time was unenlightened, but it means that there was a birth of a new way of looking at the world, primarily because of the rise of science. And because of the rise of science in the 1700s, many philosophers began to say we need to look at the world with a more rational approach. And the upshot of that was, as rationality and science became more and more important, the authority of the state and of the church began to be questioned. Thinkers and philosophers began to question things like the divine right of kings. Do monarchs have some divine right given them by God to rule? Or does the right to rule come up from the people? And you see the birth of democracy, or at least the rebirth of democracy the movements in Western Europe, the French Revolution, and of course, we're much more familiar with the American Revolution. Born out of this Enlightenment way of thinking that no longer are we going to look to kings to be those who are placed in authority by God, but rather those who rule over nations are placed there by the will of the people. We in America certainly resonate with the idea that power comes from the people. Not only is the divine right of kings and the rule of monarchs called into question during the Enlightenment, so is the authority of the church. The authority of the church to say, we say it, therefore believe it, it's so, don't question it, don't question us. Many people begin to question the church and religious authorities. And this is not only happening in the church, it's happening in Judaism as well. Because remember, Judaism is where we're focusing today. This movement of the Enlightenment begins to move among Jewish scholars and Jewish leaders and rabbis. And there is a movement within Judaism that would be called Reformed Judaism. Reformed Judaism. And Reformed Judaism is a kind of Judaism that begins to move away from the supernatural, and again, much more to the rational, to the logical. The so-called reformers of Judaism begin to emphasize the human authorship of the holy books, not divine authorship. They begin to say that God's revelation is ongoing, that it doesn't stop with Moses or with the Torah or with the Talmud, the Mishnah, that God's revelation is ongoing. The rabbis of the Enlightenment, the thinkers of the Enlightenment who are Jewish, begin to say things like, the ethics of Judaism is what's important. The ceremonial laws of Judaism, in other words, things like obeying the Sabbath laws, the kosher laws, how you dress, some of those things, they begin to say those are no longer relevant. And they only begin to emphasize the ethical laws of Judaism. Some of these so-called Reformed rabbis and Reformed thinkers in Judaism begin to question the existence of the afterlife. They begin to question the existence of angels. They begin to question anything in the Torah that is supernatural. And again, begin to only emphasize the ethical teachings of Torah. They say the Torah is there to help us with history, to help us with legends, to give us hope. And they begin to say things like, the truth is that we don't know the truth. They begin to downplay the idea of an eternal life and say that life goes on through your children and your grandchildren. They begin to emphasize that women can have a full role in the synagogue. They begin to say that women no longer need to be separated from the men in the religion of Judaism. All these are under the umbrella of Reformed Judaism. So we're going to put that over here on this side. Reformed Judaism. Okay? Well, there's a saying that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So as some of the, we would say, I guess, liberal or progressive rabbis begin this movement in the 17th century, or the 1700s, the 18th century, called Reform Judaism, there is a backlash. There is a reaction against that. There is a reaction against the reformers that say, no, we need to hold on to all the traditions. These reforms are against everything that we as Jews hold dear. And that reaction against Reform Judaism comes to be known as Orthodox Judaism. Orthodox Judaism. Now remember, the word orthodox is actually a Greek word that means right words or right teaching. Ortho, if you think about an orthodontist, is someone who straightens your teeth. The word ortho means correct or straight. So orthodoxy means straight teaching, right teaching, correct teaching. And so there is a movement that is a counter movement to the Reform movement that's called the Orthodox movement. These are Jewish rabbis who say, we reject everything that the Reformers are doing. They say the Torah is the revealed Word of God. The Torah is the dictation of the Almighty to Moses. And not only is the written Torah from God, it is His words, that the oral law, that has been passed down and eventually recorded in the Mishnah, the Talmud, that the oral law is also directly from God. They reaffirm the supernatural aspects of Judaism. They reaffirm that God is personal, that God is omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent and eternal. And they emphasize that all of the laws are still mandatory, not only the ethical laws, but the kosher laws, the food laws, the way you dress, the Sabbath laws, the other ceremonial laws that are not necessarily related to ethics, but they're related to your everyday life. They also continue to emphasize the fact that there is going to be a Messiah someday. Now remember, Jews don't accept Jesus as Messiah, but they still believe, at least Orthodox Jews believe, that God will eventually send a Messiah. Now, when you hear the phrase Orthodox Jew or Orthodox Judaism, many of us think of a subset of Orthodox Judaism called Hasidic Judaism. Hasidic. Not all Orthodox Jews are Hasidic Jews. The word Hasidic means pious, but part of the movement of orthodoxy in Judaism was Hasidic Judaism, especially in Eastern Europe. The Hasidic Jews, the pious Jews, combined the idea of intense study of the Scriptures, of the Torah, with an ecstatic joy that comes from a personal relationship with God. And when we were in Israel in January, of course there is a large number of Hasidic and Orthodox Jews living in Israel, and you could always identify the Hasidic Jews. The men would wear black coats, black pants, white shirt, open collar, a black hat usually, a beard, the familiar sideburns that come down in curls on the side of the head. And if you've never been to Israel, you may have seen Hasidic Jews in New York City. There's a large number of Hasidic Jews in New York. Many of the way that a Hasidic Jew dress comes from the traditions of how they dressed in the 1700s. That is the way that Jewish people dressed then, and they've kept that as a traditional way of dress. Many Hasidic Jews speak Yiddish. Yiddish is a hybrid language. It's a combination of German and Hebrew. It's written with Hebrew characters, but it has a lot of the influence of the German language meshed and combined with the Hebrew language. And some of those Yiddish terms have come into American popular culture. If you hear someone say oy vey, that's Yiddish. Even a word like that guy's a real schlemiel, that's Yiddish. These are colorful terms that come out of this language that is part of Orthodox Judaism. And so you have two sort of ends of the spectrum of Judaism. A Reformed movement that really begins to move away from any of the supernatural aspects of Judaism, and also becomes much more modern in its treatment of women and in its emphasis on adapting to the modern culture. You have Orthodox Judaism that really goes the opposite way, holding on to the traditions. Now, as there almost always is when you have two ends of the spectrum, there's always a middle path, a middle way. And the middle path of Judaism on this spectrum is conservative Judaism. Conservative Judaism is primarily here in the United States. Conservative Judaism is an attempt to find that middle path somewhere between the Reform movement and the Orthodox movement, where there is still an appreciation for much of the ceremonial law, of the kosher laws, but not nearly as strict as you would find it in an Orthodox Jew. Now, I mentioned these three branches, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, because if we were to draw the tree for Judaism, like I talked about for Christianity with the different branches, these would be the three major branches of Judaism in the world today: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. And a rabbi might be one of these. And a conservative rabbi would have a much different interpretation of Scripture than a Reformed rabbi. And some synagogues are Reformed, some synagogues are conservative, some synagogues are Orthodox. There is no one central authority. There is no equivalent to a pope in Judaism. So there is no one rabbi who has authority over all the conservatives or all the reforms or all the Orthodox Jews. But these would be the three major branches of Judaism that you would find in modern world today. Now, I want to go back to what we talked about a moment ago, and one of the things I want to do with that is refer to a chart. And so I'm going to put a chart up on the screen right now. All right, let's take a look at a timeline. And hopefully you can see that. If not, I'll guide you through it. Let's talk now about Jewish history. In our last session, I talked about the history of Judaism going back to the Old Testament. Let's remember that we start with the Old Testament. We start with the story of Abraham. And if you can think about this as a timeline, and we're going to try to have some of this up on the screen as I'm talking about it. Think about a timeline that goes back at least 2000 BC. Okay? Now, when you talk about the Old Testament, there are some parts of the Old Testament that it is impossible to attach a date to. The first 11 chapters, the stories of Genesis, the stories of the flood, the stories of the Tower of Babel, etc. We don't really even try to attach a date to those stories. We usually call those prehistory. There was a time in which some scholars tried to date those stories. Most of those scholars then end up by saying that the earth is only 5,000 or 6,000 years old. Almost all Christians and Jews now believe that the earth, of course, is not only a few thousand years old, that the earth is millions of years old. And that those stories that we find in the first few chapters of Genesis, we call them prehistory. We don't even try to attach a date. The earliest we try to attach a date to a story would be the call of Abraham. And so that call of Abraham, somewhere around 1800 BC, maybe as far back as 2000 BC, but somewhere in there, between 2000 and 1700 BC, the call of Abraham. Now, I want to talk about who is in control of the land of Israel. Before the time of Abraham, the land of Israel, who was in control of it? Well, tribal people, Canaanite people that we have some archaeological records of, but we can't really identify and say the land of Israel or the land of Palestine was controlled by this people. We know that when we talk about the story of Abraham, and Abraham journeys to Canaan, his grandson Joseph becomes the prime minister of Egypt. The entire family goes to the land of Goshen in northern Egypt, where they fall into slavery. During that 400-year time, when the children of Israel are living in Egypt, growing larger and larger, and also becoming slaves of the Egyptian, who's in charge of Israel? That land of Israel, the land of Palestine or Israel, who controls it? Well, the Canaanites. It's the land of Canaan. It's a bunch of different small city-states and tribes, the Canaanites. Now we get to the time of Joshua. Joshua leads the children of Israel out of the wilderness after Moses has died. They cross the Jordan River. They come into Canaan. And the people of Israel begin to have battles against the Canaanites and all the Philistines and Jebusites and Hittites and all the other ites that we read about in the Old Testament. Israel slowly takes possession of the land of Canaan. And it becomes solidified as a nation, finally under Saul and David, the monarchy, the kingdom of Israel. Now, as I mentioned last time, the kingdom of Israel as a united kingdom only lasts a few generations. David, his son Solomon, but when we get to Solomon's son Rehoboam, the nation splits. The nation of Israel splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. Israel retains the name in the north, the southern kingdom known by Judah or Judea. And so we have a period of time of what's called the divided monarchy. Then, we know that in the 8th century BC, the Assyrians come in, they conquer the northern tribes, they take many of them off into slavery, they bring other foreign peoples and settle them in the land. That eventually becomes what we now call Samaria, or what becomes known as Samaria by the time of the New Testament, leaving only two southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, intact. Those two southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin are then conquered 586 BC by the Babylonians, aka Iraq. The Jews, who are there known by this time as Jews, as residents of Judea, the Jews are taken off into captivity in Babylon, in Iraq, and after that, the Babylonians control that territory. We know that the Babylonian Empire is then conquered by the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire allows the Jews to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, rebuild the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. Now, it's after that, after the time of the Persians, that the Old Testament ends. And I talked last week about some of the intertestamental period. The Persians' domination of the land of Israel and Palestine eventually is conquered by Greeks, Alexander the Great. The Greeks control Palestine and Israel. There is that brief period that I mentioned last time in which a Jewish leader, Judah Maccabee, leads a revolt, and the Jews actually have once again autonomy over their own land. For about 100 years, the Hasmonean dynasty, which are the descendants of Judah the Hammer, Judah Maccabee, Israel once again rules itself. That only lasts about 100 years. The Romans then take over, and Israel/Palestine becomes a part of the Roman Empire. That lasts for several hundred years. Their domination is eventually followed by the Byzantine Empire, by the Arabs taking control of that land. We get up to about 1000 AD. We have the time of the Crusaders. Then we have the succeeders of the Crusaders, the Muslims, the Mamluks, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. So if you think about this as a timeline and you say, well, okay, who does this land belong to? Well, across the centuries, the land of Israel and Palestine has belonged to, let's recap, Canaanites, Israelites, Jews, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Hasmoneans, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans. All of these groups could make some claim to owning or belonging and saying, this is our land. That's one reason this little piece of property is so continuously in turmoil, because so many different groups have laid claim to it across the years. Now, with that timeline in mind, let's go back and think about some of the important parts of this timeline. I ended, when I was talking about Jewish history last time, I really ended with sort of the Middle Ages, the rise of Islam, the conquering of many parts of the Middle East by Muslims. And as the Muslim world solidifies its hold on the Middle East, the Christian world in Western Europe begins to not only fear Muslims, the Christian world begins to really persecute Jews. In the Middle Ages, Christian rulers often saw Jews as a threat, and Christian people began to have a great deal of anti-Semitism, this anti-Jewish prejudice. In the Middle Ages, Jews were often excluded from many fields of commerce and many professions. Jews were often forced to wear special clothing to identify them as Jews. I've told the story before. When I was a student at the University of Oklahoma, OU is famous for having a medieval fair. And people dress up in medieval clothing. Well, when I was a student there, I took 2 courses in Hebrew civilization with a rabbi. And he decided as an educational approach for us as a class to have a booth at the medieval fair explaining Judaism during medieval times. And we created a flyer to hand out to people, and we all dressed in Jewish clothing, the way a Jew would dress during the Middle Ages, which meant I had to wear a yellow robe that signaled me as a Jew. I had to wear sort of a pointed hat that was also yellow, and I wore a beard and tried to look as much like a Jew in the Middle Ages would look. And the story I told was a little boy came up to me and asked if I was a wizard because I was wearing a robe and a beard and a pointy hat. I said, no, I'm a Jew. And at that point, this little boy repeated what I'm sure his father would have said. He said, well, my father says the only good Jews are dead Jews. This little boy, this was during the 1980s, this little boy had already been poisoned by anti-Semitism. This little boy had been taught to hate Jewish people already in the 1980s. Anti-Semitism goes back for centuries and centuries and centuries. And it was at one of its worst periods during medieval times. Jews were excluded from going into, of course, the army. They didn't trust them to be loyal soldiers. Many other trades excluded Jews. And it was because of that in the Middle Ages that many Jews gravitated towards certain professions. And here, one of those interesting bits of history, the church in the Middle Ages decided that it was illegal or it was immoral for a Christian to charge interest. And so the church of those days, the Catholic Church, forbade Christians from charging interest, basically from banking. Well, Jews were not under that order because this was a rule that only applied to Christians. So many, many Jews flocked to banking as a profession, where money lending was allowed by the rabbis. And that flocking of Jewish people in the Middle Ages to the financial businesses, to the banking professions, began a trend that is still in existence today. Jewish families gravitated towards financial jobs, and that is well into our time. There's a higher percentage of Jewish people in the financial industries than in other businesses. And that goes back to the Middle Ages when they were barred from doing anything else, but were allowed to be in that profession. I think I mentioned last time that also towards the end of the Middle Ages, many Jews were forced out of many Western European countries. I was taught the little rhyme by the rabbi about Spain. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and Ferdinand threw out the Jews. That same King Ferdinand that we know financed Columbus's expedition to the New World, that same King Ferdinand expelled all Jews from Spain in that same year that Columbus sailed. And I think I ended up last week talking about how one of the few countries that would accept Jewish immigrants, one of the few places where Jews could actually go was Poland. And the Jewish population of Poland grew significantly. Now, let's jump forward a little bit. Jews lived in many parts of the world. We talked about the diaspora. The diaspora is the idea that Jews were living in all different countries all over the world. I mentioned the Ottoman Empire, and again, I think we have a map of that. When we think about this Middle Eastern part of the world, the Ottoman Empire rules the Middle East for about 400 years, right up until the time of World War I. For 400 years, the Middle East is under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And if you see that map in front of you, you'll see that all of the colored area was part of the Ottoman Empire. And when we say the Ottoman Empire, we're talking about Turkey. It seems like different countries and groups sort of take turns having empires. We talked about the Greeks, talked about the Romans, talked about the Babylonians or the Persians. Well, the Ottoman Empire was an empire that was centered in Turkey. And if you look at this map of the Ottoman Empire, you'll notice that it extended all the way in the west from Algiers and Tunis and Tripoli all the way into Egypt, Cairo, all the way down into Mecca and Medina, which today is part of Saudi Arabia, all the way over into Baghdad, Jerusalem, Damascus, Constantinople, all the way up to Budapest in the north, and all the way to the Caspian Sea in the east. The Ottoman Empire was a huge, huge empire. And that empire included Palestine and Israel. By the end of the 19th century, so the end of the 1800s, when the Ottomans were still in control of what we would call Palestine or Israel, this area of Palestine and Israel was inhabited by a variety of people. Muslims, Arab Muslims, Christian Arabs, Jews, many other groups were living in that part of the world. But there were more Jews living in other parts of the world than were living in the Middle East. Matter of fact, there were more Jews living in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland, than anywhere else. There were also Jews living in America. Many Jews had immigrated to America starting in the 1800s. Now, in the later part of the 1800s, in the later part of the 19th century, there was the rise of something that you've probably heard the phrase. There was the rise, I have to bend down and pick up my eraser, the rise of Zionism. And I know you've heard that term before. The rise of Zionism. Zionism. What was Zionism? As Jews were pushed out of country after country, as the rise of anti-Semitism became a reality in much of Europe, many Jewish leaders said, we need our own homeland. We need a Jewish nation. And of course, the logical place for that Jewish nation, they said, was their original homeland, was Israel, was Palestine. So in the late part of the 19th century, the late 1800s, many Jewish leaders began to call for a Jewish homeland in Israel. In 1897 was the first Zionist Congress, which was held in Switzerland. But out of that and many other meetings that led up to that, Jewish leaders began to say, if you're Jewish, move back to Israel. Go to Israel, immigrate to Israel, which of course is under the control, remember, of the Ottoman Empire. But go into the Ottoman Empire, go to Israel and buy land. Purchase farms, purchase homelands there in Palestine, in Israel. And so Jewish leaders began to say, move to Israel, establish homes there. This was the idea of Zionism, of Jews returning back to their homeland. Now the Ottoman Empire, of course, is Turkish, so it is Muslim, but the Ottomans allowed Christians and Jews to live in the Ottoman Empire. But there was a wave of Jews moving in to Palestine, into Israel, in the 1800s, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And as more and more Jews begin to move into the Ottoman Empire and move specifically into the ancient homeland of Israel, Palestine, there's great tension between them and the Arab Muslims who are also living in Palestine. And this conflict between Jews and Arab Muslims begins to intensify. As more and more Jews move to Israel, they get into more and more skirmishes with Muslim Arabs who are living there. Some of this is fueled by territorialism, it's fueled by nationalism, it's fueled by economic factors. But all of this leads the Ottoman Empire in 1892 to say, no more. We're not going to allow any foreigners, and they meant Jews, to buy up land in our nation. They forbade foreigners from purchasing property because, you see, Jews all through the 1800s had been moving to the Ottoman Empire, moving to Israel, and buying land, buying as much land as they could. And just to show the influx into that area, between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, about 33,000 Jews moved to Israel within about a 10 to 15 year period. By 1914, there were about 60,000 Jews living in Israel. Just 20 years earlier, there had only been 30,000. So about 30,000 Jews moved into Israel in the last 10 years of the 1800s, the first 10 years of the 1900s. So there's about 60,000 Jews living in Palestine or Israel by 1914. Well, I mentioned 1914 because that's a historic date. If you know your history, you know that that is the beginning of what was called the Great War. Today we call it World War I. But of course they didn't know there was going to be a sequel, so they just called it the Great War. And World War I began in 1914, and I won't go into all the history of the First World War, but remember this huge territory I referred to, that is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire has to decide who they're going to align with in the First World War. And the Ottoman Empire aligns with Germany during World War I. They align with Germany against Great Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States. Of course, the United States doesn't get into that war at the beginning. So the Ottoman Empire, which is this huge territory, they're aligned with Germany against the Allies. The Arabs and Jews who lived within the Ottoman Empire have a different idea. The Arabs and Jews want freedom from the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs want their own homeland. The Jews want their own homeland. And their thinking is, if the Ottoman Empire is defeated in this war, we can get our own homeland. We can have a Jewish state. We can have an Arab state. And that's their hope, that they will be able to emerge from this conflict with their own country. Now, the Allies had their own ideas. And the idea that the Allies had, when I say the Allies, I'm talking about Great Britain, France, and Russia, because this is before the U.S. gets into the conflict. They have the idea that if they win, they're going to carve up the Ottoman Empire and have each country have dominion over certain chunks of the Ottoman Empire. In 1916, the Allies, Germany, Great Britain, France, Russia, draw up something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was, it was a secret agreement that said, here's how we'll carve up the Ottoman Empire. The agreement was that Britain would get Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and southern Iraq. France would get southeast Turkey, northern Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And Russia would get Istanbul and Armenia. Now, this was a secret agreement as to how these Western powers would begin to control the former Ottoman Empire. Now, the Allies, at the same time they were deciding how to carve up the Ottoman Empire, were also telling the Arabs, hey, if you'll fight with us against the Ottomans, you'll get your own homeland. In other words, they were speaking really out of both sides of their mouth. And just on one little trivial or bit of trivia, the chief British negotiator with the Arabs during this time was a man by the name of T.E. Lawrence, made famous as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was speaking with the Arabs, trying to get them to side with the Allies against the Ottoman Empire and against the Germans. So the Arabs, the Palestinians, are thinking, if the Ottoman Empire is defeated, we'll get a homeland. They didn't realize that the Allies had this Sykes-Picot Agreement that this is how we're going to dominate and control the Ottoman Empire after the war. Now, when I was teaching this on Wednesday night last week, I said, how many of you all have ever heard of the Sykes-Picot Agreement? And no one had, and I'd never heard of it until recently when I was doing some research. But you know who talks about the Sykes-Picot Agreement in his speeches all the time? The leader of ISIS. The leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, refers back to the Sykes-Picot Agreement as a grievance about how the Palestinian Arabs were treated by the Western nations 100 years ago. Remember, this was an agreement from 1916, so exactly 100 years ago. The leader of ISIS refers to this agreement often in his speeches as a way to say, we, Muslim Arabs, have been mistreated. We have been lied to. We have been cheated. And so you see, not only do the leaders of radical Islam continually refer back to the Crusades as a bone of contention and refer to the Western powers as crusaders as a way of stoking up historical hatred. They refer back to what happened during World War I as another example of how they saw themselves being mistreated and abused by the Western powers, by the Christian powers. Well, indeed, the Allies win World War I. Indeed, the Western powers do carve up the Ottoman Empire. And indeed, Palestine falls to Great Britain. Great Britain now is in control of this area of Israel/Palestine. And it's called the British Mandate. So from the end of World War I, the Brits control Palestine. And this is a tricky, tricky place to control. At the end of the First World War, what is the population of the British Mandate of Palestine/Israel? Well, it's about 78% Muslim, about 11% Jew, and about 10% Christian. And there's a lot of conflict between these groups, between the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims, particularly between the Muslims and the Jews. There are riots, there are skirmishes, there are all kinds of unpleasantness happening during this period in between World War I and the outbreak of World War II. Things are not settled. There's just a lot of unrest, and there's a lot that the Jews don't like the Brits being in control, the Arabs don't like the Brits being in control, the Jews and the Arabs aren't getting along with each other, lots of unrest. But as you know, the Great War that was called, the World War I, that was called the War to End All Wars, doesn't end all wars. World War II breaks out. And again, there is the hope from both Jew and Arab that at the end of World War II, this will be settled, and there'll be a Jewish homeland, and there'll be a Palestinian homeland. The Jews in Palestine side solidly with the Allies. The Palestinian Arabs are divided as to whether to side with the Allies or the Axis, because they're trying to say which is going to be the best for us, which outcome will give us a Palestinian homeland. So some side with the Allies, some side with the Axis. But the war, as you know, ends, the Allies win, and at the end of World War II, the Jews and Arabs are both anxious to be out from under British control. And the Brits have to decide what they're going to do. There are now thousands and thousands and thousands of Jews, those who are not killed in the Holocaust, who want to move to Israel and establish this Jewish homeland. There are tens of thousands of Jews urging that the borders be open where they can immigrate to Israel. Great Britain feels like if they allow all these Jews to come into Israel and Palestine, there's going to be even more conflict. They want to limit Jewish immigration. But Harry Truman, who's the president of the U.S., very much wants to help the Jews who've survived the Holocaust. He puts great pressure on Great Britain to allow the Jews to come into Israel. And the way he applies that pressure is the British economy is in terrible shape at the end of World War II. They have huge debts. They look to America to alleviate some of their misery. Harry Truman says, we in the U.S. will only help you economically if you allow 100,000 Jews to come into Israel. So Truman puts pressure on Great Britain to allow 100,000 Jews to come in to the territory of Israel/Palestine. That's what happened. So now you have many, many, many more Jews living in Israel. And the heavy Palestinian Arab majority begins to shrink. Well, the United Nations, which is newly formed at the end of World War II, knows that something has to be done about Israel/Palestine. So the United Nations comes up with a plan to create a two-state solution, a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state, with the city of Jerusalem becoming sort of an international city open to all, not part of either state. So the United Nations comes up with a plan, a Jewish state, an Arab state, and Jerusalem as a kind of like the Vatican, just an independent city open to all. This plan is presented to the Jews and to the Muslim Arabs living there. The Jewish leaders accept the plan. The Arab leaders do not. And that, we look back historically and say, what if? What if both sides had agreed to this plan? What would the world look like? But the Arabs do not accept the two-state solution. They think it is unfair to them. They think that they're not getting nearly enough territory. And so violence escalates more and more and more. And on May 14th, 1948, the leaders of the Jews in Israel/Palestine, especially a fellow by the name of David Ben-Gurion, declares Jewish independence from Great Britain, declares the existence of the state of Israel, of an independent Jewish state. So Israel, the modern state of Israel, is born in 1948. Now, as soon as the Jews, the Israelis, declare themselves to be a sovereign nation in 1948, they are attacked by Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan. So 4 Muslim Arab countries attack Israel as soon as they declare their independence. This war is very short-lived. There is a truce in place within a couple of months. And at the end of that truce, Israel controls not only the land that they were originally going to get in the UN plan, but about 26% of what was going to be the Arab state. Jordan is in control of part of the land, including the city of Jerusalem. The Gaza Strip is controlled by a puppet government of the Egyptians. And Jordan, the country of Jordan, annexes the West Bank. So you've got a mixed bag of who's controlling Israel/Palestine. Well, that's 1948. That situation lasts for almost 20 years until 1967. In 1967, Israel is invaded and attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. This is what's called the Six-Day War. And in that Six-Day War, as those 3 Arab nations attack Israel, it goes badly for the Arab nations because Israel captures the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel now increases its territory significantly. Israel now controls a huge chunk of Palestine/Israel. And that's the status quo for about 10 years until 1978, when under President Carter, the Camp David Accords come into play, and Israel and Egypt make a treaty that Israel gives the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt in exchange for Egypt recognizing Israel as a sovereign nation, Israel's right to exist. You can see that the history of Israel is fraught with conflict and warfare and turmoil. When we traveled there in January, and our tour guide was a fellow who had lived there, immigrated to Israel from South America when he was a teenager. He was Jewish and he wanted to live in Israel. He came to Israel. He joined the Israeli army as a teenager. He fought in the '67 war. He was somebody who had been a part of this history from almost the beginning. And you could tell, of course, he had a very Israeli perspective, but he also, was not so blinded to the opposite viewpoint of the Palestinians. And he bemoaned the fact that if only the plan from 1948, the United Nations plan, this two-state solution, if it had been enacted then, what might the world look like if that two states had agreed to live side by side in harmony at the end of World War II? The situation in the Middle East continues to be incredibly fluid. There continues to be, unfortunately, deep-seated mistrust and hostility between Israelis and their neighbors. And there is always the hope and the prayer for peace. I'll be talking over the next couple of weeks more about the present-day situation in Israel and Palestine, in the Middle East. I'll also come back and we'll talk more about how modern-day Islam operates in that part of the world, and how it is that some of the things that we read about in the newspaper about how Islam is practiced in different parts of the world, how that doesn't seem to line up with the Quran, and how it doesn't seem to line up with much of what we hear from Muslim scholars and leaders here. How does that all fit together? How can the behavior of some people under the banner of Islam be so radically different from the teachings of Muslim leaders, the teachings of the Quran, the teachings even of Muhammad? So we'll look at modern Middle Eastern the situation, and we'll look at modern Islam and how that interplays and contrasts with Judaism and Christianity. And we just have a couple more weeks to try to make some sense of how this world situation all fits together. We'll see you then.